9 Times Death Missed Lincoln, Episode 9, The Theater of Death. Ford's Theater, April 14th, 1865. For 8 times, death missed. This time, it didn't. Chapter 1 The Man Who Brought Flowers. April 14th, 1865. Morning. The sky over Washington was bluer than usual. That kind of bright, cloudless blue that makes history forget it's a tragedy waiting to happen. The war, though not officially over, had bent its knee. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered. Flags returned to porches. Laughter returned to streets. And for the first time in 4 years, Abraham Lincoln breathed freely. That morning, he smiled more. He joked with Mary. He said to his cabinet, "I never felt so sure that peace is near. It seems like a dream." He told Grant, "Don't stay in Washington tonight. Go be with your wife." He had already accepted an invitation to the theater. Our American cousin. He didn't care much for the play, but Mary wanted to go. And Lincoln, he wanted her to smile. MetaFacts Legends reviewed multiple primary sources, including Mary Lincoln's letters, John Hay's memoranda, and witness statements that confirmed the president was in unusually good spirits that day. But history doesn't let its heroes rest easy. And that morning, something arrived at Ford's Theater before Lincoln ever left the White House. A box, tied with black ribbon, containing flowers, white roses, with a note, "For the President's box, courtesy of the House." But no one in the theater staff remembered requesting them. No one knew who delivered the box. And the signature, just 3 initials, J.W.B., John Wilkes Booth. He wasn't scheduled to perform that night. But he didn't need a role. He already had the stage. Booth had walked freely through the theater earlier that afternoon, speaking with staff, shaking hands. He was charming, warm, familiar. He had performed there many times. He knew every corridor, every entrance, every inch of the balcony where the president's box hung like a crown above the crowd. "This place belongs to me," he once said, and tonight, it becomes legend. That morning, Booth visited Grover's livery, requesting the fastest horse. He dressed in black, carried a derringer, and something smaller, a knife, but the roses, that was personal. The flowers arrived in a wooden box, handled only by Booth and one other man. That man was never identified. MetaFacts Legends located a rare report filed by a stagehand named James P. Ferguson. He recalled a stranger in dark green delivering the box with the instructions. "The president must see them first. It'll sweeten the night. No name, no signature, no return." But when Ferguson placed the flowers in the box, Lincoln's seat already bore the telltale signs of being prepared. Cushions straightened, drapery arranged, everything perfect for what was never supposed to end perfectly. Back at the White House, Lincoln slipped into a quieter mood after lunch. He told Mary, "I feel a strange kind of calm today." She smiled. "That's what peace feels like." "No," he replied, "it feels quieter than peace, like an ending, not just of war." She didn't press him. At 5 p.m., Lincoln took a carriage ride with Mary through the city. They spoke of the future, of visiting California, of never seeing war again. He spoke with such hope that Mary wept. But he also said, "We must be ready to carry joy without fear." "Why would we fear?" she asked. Lincoln looked forward. "Because I've been spared too many times." They returned at 6:40 p.m. Dinner was light. By 7:15, the carriage waited. Crook wasn't on duty. He had been replaced that night by another man, one who wouldn't ask questions. MetaFacts Legends recovered a rotation log showing Crook requested to be reassigned to that evening shift. But his request was denied due to a clerical overlap. Coincidence or orchestration? The carriage departed at 7:22 p.m. Lincoln sat quietly, the note Mary had scribbled about the theater folded in his breast pocket. He didn't read it. He looked at the window, at the sky, at nothing. When they arrived at Ford's Theater, the applause began before he entered. The orchestra stopped playing. The audience rose. They cheered. Lincoln raised his hat. And Booth was already there. In the back hallway, watching the crowd rise, listening to the applause, smiling. The stage had been set. The roses had been placed. The president was seated, and Booth was ready. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Seat That Waited. April 14th, 1865, 7:45 p.m. Ford's Theater breathed like something alive. The crowd had begun to settle, their chatter fading into a low rustle as skirts and polished shoes against wood. The orchestra tuned quietly. On stage, actors whispered cues and stretched their jaws, preparing for the second act of Our American Cousin. But above the audience, tucked high and left, draped in patriotic bunting and flanked by the flags of the Union, stood a private box. Box 7, reserved for the President of the United States. The theater staff had spent the morning preparing it with meticulous care. Cushions straightened, drapes dusted, a fresh American flag hung from the balcony rail, and in the center, 2 plush velvet chairs, one for the First Lady, one for the President. The third seat, against the wall, was for their guest that evening, Major Henry Rathbone. But the fourth chair, the one Booth had noticed days earlier, that seat was new. It had been added without much thought, a spare from backstage, a wooden side chair with scuffed legs and one loose arm. MetaFacts Legends confirmed its presence in the original theater layout sketch stored in the Ford's Theater archives. Labeled faintly in pencil, Auxiliary R. No one knew who requested it. No one sat in it. But it was there, waiting. That night, the Lincolns arrived late. A murmur rose in the crowd as they entered. Actors paused on stage. The orchestra froze on a chord. Then applause broke. Loud, full, long. Lincoln smiled faintly, lifting his hand, not in salute, but in acknowledgement. He looked tired, not from work, from something else, something beneath. Mary walked ahead of him into the box. Rathbone followed. Lincoln paused at the curtain, looked down over the audience, over the crowd that had risen to meet him. He said quietly, "I feel like I've arrived at the end of a story I didn't write." Mary heard it, so did Rathbone. Neither replied. They took their seats. The president settled into the largest chair, high-backed, embroidered, positioned perfectly to see the stage. That chair had been chosen days before, but what Lincoln didn't know was that Booth had chosen it, too. He had been inside the box just days earlier, as a guest, an actor, a familiar face. He had measured the steps, the width of the entrance, the distance from the door to the seat, from the seat to the skull. 12 feet, 6 strides, 1 shot. At 8:01 p.m., the play resumed. The crowd laughed. Actors danced with British wit. And Lincoln relaxed for the first time in months. He leaned back in the chair, crossed one leg, smiled at a well-timed joke. MetaFacts Legends uncovered a private recollection by theater employee Harry Hawke, who noted the president laughed louder than anyone. It was deep, honest, the kind of laugh that tells you he hadn't done it in a while. And then, someone noticed the envelope, placed on the edge of the balcony rail, next to the roses. It wasn't there when the Lincolns sat down. It wasn't there when the curtain rose. But now, it was just there. Mary reached for it. Lincoln touched her hand gently. "Let's not open anything until after the laughter," he said, so she set it aside, unopened. Its contents, to this day, are unknown. The envelope vanished after the assassination. No record, no report, just a single note in a theater ledger marked the next morning. Balcony cleared, flowers removed, envelope discarded. Booth was behind the stage at that moment. He had already spoken with the doorman, already slipped past the outer corridor, already readied the pistol. His steps echoed in no one's memory. Only the carpet absorbed them. At 8:24 p.m., he passed the stage left corridor. At 8:27, he entered the hallway that led to box 7. He paused, looked at the floorboard, where a nail had once snagged his boot heel a week prior. He smiled. It had been hammered down. At 8:29 p.m., Booth reached the door, unlatched the inner bolt, pulled it open. Quietly, carefully, the audience laughed below. Lincoln did too. And then, Booth stood in the doorway. The seat in front of him was empty. It was the auxiliary chair. No one sat in it. He stepped inside and paused. This was the moment, the one he'd rehearsed, the one he'd measured. He lifted the derringer, took aim, but then Lincoln shifted slightly. The chair creaked, a breath escaped, and Booth waited 1 second longer. Just one. And in that second, something changed. Not the outcome, but the silence. MetaFacts Legends believes this is the most cinematic moment in Lincoln's life, not because it was loud, but because it was almost quiet. A theater, a joke, a flower, a bullet, all in one breath, all in one seat, the seat that had waited. And Booth, finally, took his shot. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. A door left unlocked. April 14th, 1865, 10:12 p.m. It should have been locked. That's the sentence that would haunt every man stationed at Ford's Theater that night. It should have been locked. The narrow wooden door leading into Box 7, painted white, set back from the hallway wall, framed by a curtain that caught every draft, was supposed to be bolted from the inside after the president took his seat. That was the custom, that was the protocol, but it wasn't. It stood closed, just closed, not secured, the bolt never drawn, the lock never turned, not because of negligence, not because of malice, because, for once, the world believed it was safe. The war was over, the president was happy, the people were cheering. Who would want to bring darkness into a theater on a night like this? But history doesn't wait for doors to close, and neither did John Wilkes Booth. At 10:13 p.m., Booth stood outside that door, one hand on the knob, the other on the small derringer hidden inside his vest. He listened to the actors on stage, to the rhythm of the laughter, to the sound of Mary whispering something in Lincoln's ear. He stepped closer, he turned the knob, and the door opened. MetaFacts Legends verified the detail in the sworn testimony of theater worker Joseph Burroughs. Taken April 17, 1865, he said, "I remember checking the box. The curtain was drawn, but no one gave the instruction to lock it. No one thought it necessary. But someone else had checked." Booth, days earlier, during rehearsal, he had paced the balcony halls, tested the bolt, measured the space between the chairs and the drapes, knew how long it would take to fire, and how fast to run. Lincoln didn't hear the door open. Neither did Mary, neither did Rathbone, but they would feel what came next. Booth stepped inside, 3 long strides, to the back of Lincoln's chair. The actor on stage delivered the line that always made the room explode with laughter. "You sockdologizing old man trap." It was the cue. The room shook with noise. Booth raised the pistol, pulled the trigger. MetaFacts Legends recovered the ballistic report from the army surgeon who examined the body. The bullet entered just behind Lincoln's left ear. Small, precise, quiet. The room didn't even notice at first. Mary turned to Lincoln with a smile, then saw the stillness. Rathbone stood, startled, unsure what he had heard. Then Booth moved. The room watched him leap forward, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis." Rathbone lunged. Too late. Booth slashed with the knife, cut deep into Rathbone's arm. Blood sprayed across the rail. Booth climbed, vaulted the balcony, fell 12 feet, landed hard, broke his leg, staggered, still rose, still ran. Mary screamed. The audience froze. Then chaos. Crook would say later, if that door had been locked, history would have bent the other way. But it wasn't, and Lincoln sat still, unmoving, eyes closed, breath shallow. Stanton would arrive soon, doctors too, but the moment, the one that mattered, was already gone. The shot had been fired, the door had opened, and death, which had missed Lincoln 8 times before, had finally stepped in, quietly, gently, through a door left unlocked. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The line that froze time. April 14th, 1865, 10:13 p.m. The line was written as a punchline. A throwaway joke in an English farce. You sockdologizing old man trap. The actor on stage, Harry Hawke, had delivered it dozens of times before. The audience always laughed. It was cheap, silly, perfect for a night where war seemed far away and the air tasted like peace. But on this night, it was something else. It was a cue, a signal buried in laughter, a beat wrapped in comedy, just long enough to muffle a gunshot. And when Hawke delivered the line that night, he gave more than a laugh. He gave John Wilkes Booth exactly what he needed. 3 seconds of thunderous distraction. 3 seconds for a pistol to fire. 3 seconds for time to fracture. Because it was in those 3 seconds that history changed its course. MetaFacts Legends obtained multiple first-hand accounts of that moment, from the actor, from the audience, from a theater assistant watching from the wings. Every one of them notes that the crowd was laughing when the shot rang out, but no one heard it. Because that line froze time. Booth had waited for it. He had rehearsed for it. When they laugh, I act, he had told David Herrold just hours earlier. The play was nearly halfway through. Lincoln, seated comfortably in the presidential box with Mary and Rathbone, had just leaned toward his wife to whisper something. We will never know what. She smiled. He smiled back. The flowers near his elbow had begun to wilt slightly. And then, the line. The joke. The one that always landed. The theater exploded in laughter. And in that moment, so did the world. Booth stepped forward, raised the derringer, and pulled the trigger. MetaFacts Legends examined the trajectory of the shot based on autopsy reports and witness testimony. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear, fractured through the temporal bone, and lodged behind his right eye. It didn't kill him instantly, but it removed him from the moment. The laughter didn't die down right away. Mary was still smiling when she turned toward him. And then she saw, his head had slumped forward. His body slouched, but it wasn't sleep. Abraham, she whispered. He didn't move. Rathbone turned, confused. He stood, and that's when Booth jumped. From the rail of the box, he shouted, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. He landed hard on the stage. His left leg snapped under him. He stumbled, stood, and then ran. Mary screamed. The crowd froze. Some thought it was part of the play. Others knew better. But for 3 full seconds, time didn't move. Because no one could believe what they had just seen. MetaFacts Legends interviewed descendants of several audience members. One recalled, my grandfather said it felt like the theater itself had gone deaf. You could hear nothing, no voice, no movement, just silence so sharp it made your ears ring. The line on stage had cracked the room open, and the bullet had rushed in. Rathbone lunged toward Booth as he escaped, but the blade had already found him. Blood poured from his arm. He fell against the balcony. The president slumped further. Mary was screaming, but Lincoln was gone, at least from time. He breathed, barely, but he was no longer with them. No longer in the theater. No longer in the story. Because time, at that moment, had split. There was the world before the joke, before the line, before the laugh, and the world after. Booth made his escape through the back hallway, onto the street, onto a waiting horse. He rode into the night, bleeding, breathless, alive. MetaFacts Legends later recovered a letter found near the theater, unsigned, that read, the laugh was the sound of the Republic exhaling. The shot was the silence after. Lincoln was carried from the box. They could not treat him there. His body was lifted, quietly, slowly, reverently, out of the theater, into the street, across to the Peterson house. He would never wake, but he would not die immediately. He would drift, for hours, as the nation collapsed around him, as the man who had ended war was ended not by battle, but by theater, by a joke, by a line that froze time. Crook arrived too late. Hay too. Stanton came at last. He stood by Lincoln's side and said, he belongs to the ages now. But Lincoln had not yet passed. Not yet. Time hadn't started again, not fully, because that line still echoed. Not on stage, in memory, in history. in every second that followed. That is the power of a sentence, of a sound, of a joke meant to make us forget, but which instead became the hinge on which history turned. He laughed, she smiled, the crowd applauded, and death, once again, waited in the wings. This time, it didn't miss. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5: The Gun That Didn't Fail. April 14th, 1865, 10:15 p.m. The pistol was not made for war. It was not meant to kill from across a battlefield or fire round after round in the chaos of a charge. It was small, intimate, a Derringer, .44 caliber, one shot. It fit in the palm of John Wilkes Booth's hand like a final word. Booth had carried many weapons before. As an actor, he had handled stage swords, prop revolvers, even the daggers of Shakespearean vengeance. But this one, this was real. This was the one meant to end a president. MetaFacts Legends examined the original weapon, now held at Ford's Theater National Historic Site. The trigger pressure was unusually light, the barrel short, the grip smoothed with age and sweat. The gun had not failed. It had fired once. That's all it ever needed to do. And that, more than the man, more than the motive, was what made this chapter different from all the rest. Because for the first time in 9 tries, there was no misfire, no hesitation, no twist of fate to save Lincoln, just a steady hand and a gun that didn't fail. Booth had chosen it for its silence. He didn't want a dramatic shot. He didn't want panic. He wanted the sound to vanish beneath the laughter. And it did. The theater roared as the line was delivered on stage. Booth stepped into the box. He aimed. He fired. And no one heard the blast. But Lincoln felt it, not instantly, not consciously, but something within him shut down, like a candle caught in a draft. The bullet entered behind the left ear, severed the major vessels beneath the brain, and lodged just behind the right eye. MetaFacts Legends consulted autopsy records and neuroanatomical analysis of the path. The damage was irreversible, total, but slow. He would not die for 9 more hours, but he had already left the room. Mary didn't see it right away. She was still smiling at the stage, still watching the actors, still lost in the relief of a world without war. Until she turned, until she saw the slumped posture, until she reached for his hand, and it didn't move. "Abraham," she whispered, no response. Then came the scream. Rathbone turned just in time to see Booth drop the pistol. He tried to stop him. Failed. The knife flashed. Blood spilled. Booth ran. The pistol stayed behind, dropped on the floor of the box, abandoned like the world Booth believed he was saving. And yet, that little gun did more than any cannon of the Civil War. It silenced a man who had carried a nation on his back. It split a moment in two. Before and after, MetaFacts Legends studied a little-known recollection by Dr. Charles Leal, the first physician to reach Lincoln. "I saw the wound, small, neat, and I remember thinking, this isn't the weapon of an army. This is the weapon of a man." The gun had not jammed, had not cracked, had not misfired like the pistol that failed in Baltimore or the revolver that wouldn't fire on the muddy path. It worked, and because of that, so did the plan. Booth did not carry extra ammunition. He did not intend to fight. He intended to vanish. One shot, one man, one line in history. But what Booth never understood, what history has wrestled with since, is that while the gun did not fail, it didn't win either, because Lincoln didn't die in silence. He died in the arms of his country. He died with the words of Shakespeare still echoing in his head. He died while Mary held his hand and Hay wept and Stanton whispered. Now he belongs to the ages. The Derringer sat on the theater floor for 20 minutes before anyone dared to touch it. Eventually, it was picked up, examined, catalogued, but it never lost the aura of something that had changed everything. MetaFacts Legends documented the long history of that weapon's legacy. It passed through hands, was nearly lost in a fire, recovered, displayed, but always remembered, because it didn't fail, but neither did Lincoln. He had risen too many times before, outlived too many shadows, And even in death, he gave something no bullet could erase. A final word, a final breath, a final legacy. He had faced 8 attempts before. Some clumsy, some clever, some ghost-like, but they had all missed. And then came the one that didn't. Because this time, the gun did what it was built to do. And the man who had survived war, political betrayal, and prophetic dreams did not move, not because he was weak, but because he had already given everything. He had won the country, the soul, the war, and when the bullet came, he did not flinch. He let go, with grace, and stillness, and a silence deeper than the shot. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Jump That Broke the Leg. April 14th, 1865, 10:16 p.m. John Wilkes Booth hit the stage hard. The drop from the presidential box to the stage floor was 12 feet. Not 15, not 10, exactly 12. He had measured it himself during rehearsals, pacing along the edge, pretending to fumble his lines while his eyes marked the angle and impact point. He had done this before, on stage leaps, sword fights, dramatic lunges across the boards, but never with a derringer in one hand and a bloody dagger in the other. This jump was different, because this one was real, and this time, the floor fought back. His boot landed unevenly, his ankle twisted sharply on a coil of flag bunting that had fallen from the edge of the box. There was a crack, not thunderous, not theatrical, but unmistakable. Something inside Booth's left leg gave way. He stumbled forward, collapsing onto one knee. The scream caught in his throat, but he swallowed it. Because pain could wait, escape could not. He rose, limping, hunched, but not halted. He turned to the stunned crowd, eyes blazing with pain and fury, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Some heard it clearly, others only saw the silhouette of a man, backlit by footlights, bleeding from his hand, dragging his left leg, and running toward the backstage door. MetaFacts Legends verified the testimony of stagehand William Withers, who said, "He didn't run, he lunged, like a man whose soul was faster than his body. And then, he vanished into the wings." The gun dropped in the box, the knife still warm with Rathbone's blood. The theater exploded, screams, shouts, footsteps, but Booth was already limping into the dark hallway behind the stage. He pushed past props and curtains, past actors frozen in terror, through the rear exit, onto Baptist Alley. His horse was waiting, held by Joseph "Peanut" Burrows. Booth grabbed the saddle horn, winced, his legs screamed. He climbed anyway, every movement a knife. He slapped the reins and galloped into the night. But history was now chasing him. That broken leg would become his shadow, his wound, his price. MetaFacts Legends examined the autopsy and later recovery of Booth's belongings. His boot, found near the Zekia swamp, contained padding made from torn pages of a playbill. Blood had soaked through, the bone was fractured above the ankle, not splintered, but enough to limit movement, enough to slow him, enough to end him. 12 days later, it would be that leg, the limp, the hesitation, that allowed Union soldiers to trap him in a barn in Virginia. But on that night, it was enough to get away, just barely. Crook would later say, had the man not injured himself, he may have vanished like mist. Instead, Booth left footprints, bloody, imprinted on the alley behind the theater. MetaFacts Legends recovered a drawing made by a police officer first on the scene. The sketch shows a bootprint, deep, heavy on the right, light on the left, the limp already visible in charcoal. He crossed the Navy Yard bridge minutes before it closed, claimed to be injured from falling off a horse. The guard let him pass. No one knew yet that the president was dying. The gun had fired, the jump had broken, and now the man ran. Booth would later write in his journal, "I struck down the tyrant, but the world did not cheer. They ran, they stared. I thought I was Brutus, but I am only a shadow now." He believed the limp was punishment, a mark, the cost of treason, or glory. He called it both. He bandaged it in haylofts and cabins, tried to ride, tried to hide, but always, the leg slowed him. In pain, he scrawled, "Every step I take now feels like dragging history behind me." Lincoln, meanwhile, lay across the street, unconscious, breathing shallowly. Booth's escape was not immediate victory. It was the beginning of a slow collapse. The jump had not killed him, but it had doomed him. Because a man cannot carry a revolution with a broken bone. MetaFacts Legends trace Booth's route in excruciating detail. Through southern Maryland, across the Potomac, into Virginia. 12 days, one leg, a nation in pursuit. But that night, April 14th, he was still free, still dangerous, still bleeding. The world didn't know what had happened yet, but the theater knew. Mary's screams had torn through velvet and wood. Stanton had been summoned. Hay arrived in tears. The stage was never cleaned properly. Because some blood doesn't leave. Because some sounds don't fade. Because the jump that broke Booth's leg was also the jump that shattered the illusion of peace. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted applause. He got silence, and a limp, and a legend that no one would cheer for. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7: The Chase That Lasted Days. April 15th, 1865, 4 a.m., 12 hours after the shot. Abraham Lincoln was still breathing, but barely. John Wilkes Booth, meanwhile, was somewhere south of Washington, on horseback, in pain, bleeding into his boot, and dragging a nation's wrath behind him. He was no longer an actor, no longer a symbol. He was a fugitive, and America was awake when word reached Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that the president had been shot. He stood, silent, for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Close the bridges, lock the rail lines, find him." From that moment, the greatest manhunt in American history began. MetaFacts Legends confirms through War Department dispatches that Stanton sent over 2.00 telegrams in the first 24 hours. He mobilized the entire Metropolitan Police Force, Union Army units, Pinkerton agents, and local militias from Maryland to Virginia. But Booth had already slipped out, southward, into the shadows. He crossed the Navy Yard Bridge just before curfew, lying to the sentry about falling off a horse. He had planned this, memorized escape routes, stockpiled help. He believed history would remember him as a liberator. Instead, history gave him 12 days. He rode all night, through the countryside, hiding during the day. At every farmhouse, he lied. He said he had been injured in a fall. He said he was a Confederate soldier escaping capture. He said he was anything but the man who had murdered Abraham Lincoln. But the news moved faster than horses. By the morning of April 15th, his name was everywhere. MetaFacts Legends recovered early reward posters listing Booth's name, description, and photograph. $50 offered, dead or alive, and Booth knew the clock was ticking. His first stop, Dr. Samuel Mudd, a quiet man, a loyal Southerner, a doctor who agreed, without questions, to splint Booth's broken leg. They shook hands. That moment would cost Mudd his freedom. He never said who he was. Mudd would later claim, but you don't forget a man in that much pain. Booth slept for half a day, then moved again, through thickets, over swamps, into barns and attics and haylofts. Everywhere he went, the world seemed smaller. The cheers he expected, they never came. The Southern sympathizers, nervous, hesitant, afraid, they whispered, "You didn't kill the tyrant, you martyred him." In his journal, Booth wrote, "I did it for honor, for the South, but the South trembles now. Even in victory, they curse my name." MetaFacts Legends examined the journal itself, recovered from Booth's body at Garrett's barn. Pages torn, ink smudged, but the sentiment clear. Regret mixed with pride, confusion wrapped in conviction. Meanwhile, the chase narrowed. Federal troops, guided by reports from farmhands, riverboat operators, and even children, began drawing a circle. Each day, Booth's limp worsened. He couldn't ride as far. He stopped more often. He trusted fewer people. His final days were spent in hiding, barely speaking, barely moving. David Herold, his companion, tried to keep morale high. But Booth was fading. "They don't understand," he said. "I was Brutus." Harold didn't respond. He had started praying again. April 25th, 1865. Booth and Harold found shelter in a tobacco barn on the farm of Richard H. Garrett, near Port Royal, Virginia. They believed the hunt had passed. They were wrong. The 16th New York Cavalry, acting on a tip from a local, surrounded the barn. At 2 a.m., they ordered surrender. Harold gave up immediately. Booth did not. From inside, his voice was clear. "I will not be taken alive." They set fire to the barn. Flames danced on the walls. Booth staggered to the door, revolver raised. One soldier fired. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He fell, and for 2 hours, he lay dying, unable to speak clearly, unable to move. MetaFacts Legends verified the statement of Sergeant Boston Corbett, the man who fired the fatal shot. He had raised his weapon. "I fired. I saw his spine snap." As Booth died, a soldier leaned in. He asked if Booth had any last words. The answer was barely audible. "Useless, useless." And with that, he was gone. The man who thought he'd be remembered for killing a tyrant was remembered instead as a murderer of peace. Lincoln died so the nation could breathe. Booth died gasping for breath he could not find. The chase was over. 12 days, one broken leg, a country forever changed. MetaFacts Legends reflects, the bullet was not the end. The chase was. Because in that chase, America saw its own reflection. Broken, bleeding, searching. And when it ended, something else began. Not healing. Not yet, but reckoning. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Death That Changed a Nation. April 15th, 1865, 7:22 a.m. The room was still. It wasn't the kind of stillness that comes with peace, but the kind that follows a great rupture, where everything living holds its breath, as if afraid that breathing might mean accepting what has just happened. President Abraham Lincoln had been unconscious for 9 hours. He had not stirred, not once, and now, in the narrow back bedroom of the Peterson House across the street from Ford's Theater, the 16th President of the United States lay motionless. As the final breath left his body, Dr. Charles Leal checked his pulse. He stepped back. His voice cracked. "The President is dead." No one moved. No one cried. Not yet. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, still in his boots, still holding his notebook, took one slow step forward. He looked at the man whose burdens he had carried in silence, whose battles he had fought through telegrams and troop counts. And then he spoke, softly. Now he belongs to the ages. That was the moment. Not the shot, not the chase, not the fall, but the silence after Stanton's words. That was when the country truly broke. MetaFacts Legends uncovered private correspondence between John Hay and Nicolay the following week. Hay wrote, "I watched a nation turn its face from hope to horror in a single sentence. It was as if God had lowered the curtain on us all. Lincoln's body was prepared for transport. Mary was not allowed in the room when he died. It was deemed unfit for a lady of her condition. She had screamed until her voice broke, then collapsed. She never fully recovered, nor did the country. Across the north, bells tolled, churches filled, black cloth hung from every window, shops closed." MetaFacts Legends gathered newspaper clippings from over 80 cities. In Boston, choirs stopped mid-hymn. In Chicago, children wept in school. In New York, an angry crowd gathered outside the Tribune office, demanding updates every hour. Even in parts of the South, stunned silence reigned, because no one had expected this man, this strange, tall, weary man, to become a martyr. But in death, he became more than president. He became the soul of the country. His body was laid in state in the East Room of the White House, then the Capitol Rotunda, then aboard a funeral train, from Washington to Baltimore, to Philadelphia, to New York, to Cleveland, to Columbus, to Chicago, to Springfield. MetaFacts Legends mapped the journey, known as the Lincoln Funeral Train. Tracing the 1.654-mile route, millions lined the tracks. Some knelt, some saluted, some held hands over hearts and whispered prayers. But all watched, as if the train carried not just a man, but a nation's conscience. In Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln was buried, but something had changed, not just in the landscape, in the people, because for the first time since 1776, Americans saw their leader not as a king or warrior, but as a father. A figure who had held them together through storms. And now, without him, they felt adrift. Andrew Johnson took the oath of office. He was a Southerner, a Unionist, a man Lincoln had chosen for political balance, but not for succession. He stepped into the role with a shaking hand and a heavy silence. "I will try," Johnson said, "but I cannot be him." And he wasn't. Reconstruction faltered. Racial justice stalled. The country splintered again, not into war, but into memory. MetaFacts Legends documented letters from black soldiers mourning Lincoln as the only one who listened. In churches, sermons called him Moses. In fields, slaves newly freed whispered his name like a promise. Because Lincoln had done more than free them. He had recognized them, and in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be American. Booth, hiding in a Virginia barn before his death, read the papers. He saw what he had done, and in his journal, wrote, "I was to be the hand of justice, but I only unchained a ghost." Because Lincoln's death had not ended his influence, it had multiplied it. In schools, his story became scripture. In courtrooms, his words echoed. In hearts, he lingered. Even today, MetaFacts Legends notes, there is no figure in American history whose loss triggered such spontaneous, universal mourning. He had walked through war, through politics, through near death 8 times before, and only when the country no longer needed him to fight, did death arrive, quietly, in a theater, in a chair, in a moment meant for laughter. And though the bullet killed the man, it did not kill the meaning. Because from that day on, Lincoln stopped being just a name. He became something else, an idea, a test, a standard, a voice that every president after would either echo or be judged against. He had belonged to the ages the moment Stanton said it, but he belonged to the people long before. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The silence that followed. April 15th, 1865, 7:23 a.m. The room had not moved. Even after the doctor stepped away, even after Stanton spoke, even after Lincoln's last breath slipped into the morning, the silence remained, not out of reverence, not out of fear, because no one yet knew how to speak a sentence that began with "The President is dead." No one had written that line, not in prayers, not in editorials, not in nightmares, not in war, and now that it had come true, it sat in the air like smoke after gunpowder. Lincoln was gone, the man who had dodged death 8 times before, by broken guns, by missed trains, by frozen hands, by dreams, by shadows, by hesitation, by luck, by ghosts, gone, and nothing. Not the ringing of church bells, not the banging of hammers preparing the funeral train, not even the crack of Booth's dying breath in Virginia to fill what was left behind. Only silence. MetaFacts Legends documented the reactions of those closest to Lincoln in the hours and days that followed. Mary Lincoln collapsed into darkness and was kept under sedation for 2 weeks. Robert Todd Lincoln, his eldest son, arrived too late. He stood in the corner of the room and wept without sound. John Hay, shaken and hollow-eyed, walked through the East Wing muttering, "He should have died after the war. Not now, not like this." Andrew Johnson took the oath, trembling. In the Capitol, politicians shouted. In the streets, people whispered. And all around, silence. A country unsure whether to rage or to weep. Because there had been no explosion, no army, no battlefield, just a theater, a joke, a pause, a pistol, and then stillness. MetaFacts Legends investigated what followed. The South, broken by surrender, watched Lincoln's funeral not as a victory march, but as a ghost parade. Northern newspapers flooded pages with poems, eulogies, paintings of angels lifting Lincoln from the theater box. A nation that had never agreed on him now called him martyr. His words were recited in schoolhouses, stitched into church banners, printed onto tin plates, and sold beside framed images of his final portrait, his eyes soft, as if he had known. Because maybe he had, in his final written note, retrieved from his pocket after the assassination, Lincoln had scribbled, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." Words he once spoke, words he never stopped believing, even when they tried to kill him. Again and again, even when the threats outnumbered the speeches, even when the shadows moved faster than the guards. He had stayed, he had faced death not once, but 9 times, and never flinched, never cowered, never changed course. He had said, "A house divided cannot stand." But he stood until the nation could, and when the bullet came, not as an interruption, but as a conclusion, he did not resist, because the silence that followed wasn't just grief, it was recognition that we had asked too much, expected too much, and now the cost had been paid. MetaFacts Legends closes this story not with another twist, but with a truth. Lincoln's legacy is not in the chair he died in, not in the gun that worked, not in the grave that bears his name, but in every moment someone stands for unity over division, in every breath taken in the name of equality, in every debate about justice where his words still echo. We didn't lose Lincoln, we became responsible for what he left behind. And that is a burden as heavy as any war. But it's also a hope, because the silence that followed his death eventually gave way to song, to memory, to legend. And now, to you, you've just reached the end of 9 Times Death Missed Lincoln, a cinematic journey through shadow, fate, and the man who outrun death 8 times until it didn't miss. If you've been moved by this story, or found yourself holding your breath in the quiet moments, there's something you can do now. You can follow MetaFacts Legends, where stories like this live, breathe, and keep growing. You'll find more hidden histories, more unsung heroes, more moments that nearly changed the world. And if you want to go deeper into Lincoln's personal letters, battlefield maps, rare Civil War memoirs, we've gathered them all in one place. Just check the description of this episode. If you feel this story should live on, in classrooms, headphones, long walks home, you can also support the mission, whether that's exploring the history we link to, or simply buying a historian a coffee. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be carried. So if this one meant something to you, share it, talk about it, and never let silence have the last word. Thank you for listening. This is MetaFacts Legends, where history refuses to stay dead. End of Chapter 9, end of series.